everything that's coming out of the Department of Education and even superintendents, emails and so forth, is this very somber concern. And, the instant something happens somewhere else in the world, like the shooting in Buffalo, for example, or even in Texas, you'll see superintendents the very next day. We're going to have an assembly. We're going to have counselors in the office. We're going to do this. We're going to do that to assist the children in coping with this trauma. And so I wanted to ask you, since we're obviously not going in the direction of it's okay and, bad, there's something bad happening somewhere in the world every day, but it's not affecting you. You're safe right now. And let's focus on what we're doing right now instead of doing what most you would think is common sense. They're marinating in this trauma. What concerns you about that as a mental health professional?
Well, just hearing you say the word serious, I mean, childhood is not a time for everything to be serious. Isn't that part of I mean, this is all about protecting children, but I mean, protecting childhood means protecting a time in life that there aren't heavy consequences for everything. I remember I attended a training once where they talked about the learning zone and the performance zone. The learning zone is a sandbox where, the worst that can happen is sand ends up in someone's eye. But if it gets thrown out the sandbox, if things get dirty, messy, ultimately, who cares? You're learning, you're exploring. You need there to not be high stakes for experimenting and encountering failures or um, mistakes or anything like that, right? And the performance zone is ideally a place we get to after we've had adequate time in the learning zone. Once we've developed a sense of mastery and competence, then it's appropriate to be in higher stakes situations where it actually matters if you know what you're doing, right? Like I'm in the performance zone right now because I've had time to learn. I mean, therapy is not a great example because the consequences are high from the moment that you start working with people. But childhood is a time for play. That's what needs to be protected, is the sense that there's not big consequences to everything you do. There needs to be appropriate consequences. That's where it's important that things be lighthearted enough of the time that you can tell if something really is serious. So like for an example, I'm in the early stages of adjusting to being a step parent. I moved in with my partner and his two kids part-time not too long ago. And I'm really fortunate. They're a great family. My partner just loves to make people laugh and smile. He loves to give his kids a really fun childhood. And they're great learners, just naturally curious kids. And so most of our interactions are pretty light and playful. And I had my first experience of really needing to discipline them recently when there was something that they had, let me just say, they damaged in playing, and they didn't realize they had damaged it. But when I brought it up, when I showed them, hey, look, this was damaged by the way that you were playing, their first reaction was, that was already like that. And to me, that was a problem because I'm like, oh, they're just lying to my face. That's not a precedent that's okay with me to set around here. So then I brought them together and I used my tone of voice and my body language and my facial expressions to get serious, not in a scolding way, but I was like, hey guys, when I brought this up to you, you lied to me. You said it was already like that. I know that's not true. And it really bothers me that you would lie to me. And kids are they learn so much non-verbally, right? And if I was playing like, hey guys, you lied to me about this, then they would just keep going in that spirit. But the important thing that helped with that being a learning moment is that things are usually fun, right? And so it's my appropriate use of seriousness to set a boundary. That's what's going to help them learn. And
Right.
my concern hearing what you're describing is that if everything's serious all the time, then kids don't know what's a big deal or not, and they don't know what boundaries and consequences they should actually really steer clear of. The line is lying to an adult about something that matters, or the line is talking to a stranger if your parents aren't around, or they need to know where those lines really are, and then those lines form the boundary, and as long as you stay within that boundary, you're safe, you can play, you can explore.
Right. Speaking of lies and talking to strangers, um, one of the other things I'm seeing is teachers, and it's now school policy, and in some cases, it's state board of education policy, that teachers are not only permitted but encouraged to transition a child, socially transition first, and then assist them, even if they're, underage, meaning under 18, to get medical transition without telling the parents and without a reason for not telling the parents other than, well, the child hasn't already told the parents. So, in other words, the presumption is if the child has not voluntarily told the parents, there's some deep and dark reason why not, and they're immediately told, I will keep your secret. We will, and then in some states like New Jersey, the teachers are, and the superintendents and everybody, principals, are instructed in how to use the computer system to set up a blind file. In other words, the student has a file the parents can see, and the student has a file under their other name that they use at school, and the parent may not be the wiser for months. And this will go on while the child is socially transitioned. And then in some cases, if they have a health facility or they have one nearby, then the child may already be given hormones and the parents will not know about it, depending on the state laws where they happen to be. As I said, this is not in response to this is an abusive parent. We have documentation. There's a case file. We're talking about just a parent. It's a parent that the kid, have you told mom and dad? No, you haven't. In other cases, we've seen material produced in part by one of the unions in California to tell teachers how to open up GSAs, gay straight alliances, these kind of clubs, and how to help the students disguise it as something else from their parents. So we're basically teaching teachers how to teach kids how to lie and obfuscate and hide things from their parents, whether that was necessary or not. And so that, to me, that does two things. It projects to the child, your parents won't like this. Whether they would have, like, you don't know what the reaction would have been, right? It's like, this is something that's a secret between us. And then it's encouraging children to lie to their parents, which is sort of the rule number one that you really never want an adult to do. So,
There are so many points there to pick apart, right? The most striking thing initially to me is the hubris of just assuming that you know best as a teacher,
right.
assuming that you know something the parents don't know and that you're a better adult in the kid's life and that that's why they're telling you this secret. There's the triangulation, right? Which, if you care about kids' mental health, you're not going to drive a wedge between them and their parents. You're going to encourage them to thrive within the environment that they've grown up in. There are a lot of assumptions being made. There's a projection of abuse, right? And I think a lot of this comes from the conflation of the trans rights movement with the gay rights movement, right? We know that the trans rights movement has latched on to the LGBT community, and that that's not actually okay with a whole lot of actual sexual minorities, lesbian, gay, and bisexual people who are not their sexual orientation has nothing to do with rewriting how we as a society think about gender or crossing boundaries that have never been crossed before or becoming lifelong medical patients. Like, lesbian, gay, bisexual people just want to live their lives in peace and have their partners. And but we know that part of how the trans rights movement has gotten so far is by exploiting people's sympathy and concern for gay rights, right? So then there's this mentality of, well, homophobia is bad. We want to protect people from homophobia, and we'd be so sympathetic if a kid was gay and their parents were homophobic. And then that translates into this kind of false equivalency. Transphobia is bad, and it's so terrible if a kid has to live with transphobic parents, and we're just going to assume that that's what's going on. And then we're going to assume that the reason that the kid's telling me, the teacher, and not the parents, is because the parents really are so bad, right? And so I think there's this projection of maybe some like unprocessed abuse that maybe the teacher themselves experienced, or the therapist, whatever the environment might be here, where maybe you really did come from a horrible home, or maybe you've worked with other kids who came from a horrible home. And so then that gets projected onto this child, and you start looking for abuse where it's not there. It's tragic that this is happening even to parents who have worked hard to cultivate good relationships with their kids' teachers. Um, and then there's the grooming. But actually, backing up a second, that there are so many reasons that a kid could say this to a teacher and not to their parents. And, one of their reasons could be that the kid actually knows that their parents wouldn't support it, uh, not because of some bigoted belief, but because their parents know them better than that, and their parents are there to protect them. Um, there's obviously a lot of social incentive right now to being trans or non-binary or using different pronouns or whatever. I mean, it takes in some ways it takes a really strong kid not to, because there's such a strong social incentive right now. There are peer groups where, half the class is using different pronouns. There are kids who are getting bullied for not. And so a lot of kids are socially transitioning at school and not at home. And what I hear from parents is that where the kid seems to really care about this the most is how they're being seen in front of their friends, which is no different from any other teenager parent dynamic that's ever existed. Mom, don't call me sweetie when you're dropping me, or like drop me off 2 blocks from school because I don't want my friends to see the car you drive. And it used to be, even a mere decade ago, it would be that the kid was embarrassed that their parent drove a beater of a car. And now it's like, because there's all this stuff about privilege and oppression,
Yep.
I've heard of kids who don't want their friends to see that they come from money, that their parents drive a nice car. I mean, there's just so many things that anybody of any generation is well familiar with, of how at a certain age you don't want your parents to embarrass you by showing the rest of the world anything about who you are at home or who you were when you were younger, or anything infantilizing. It's the same thing going on with the pronouns. Kids who are actually like not too worried about name and pronouns at home, which isn't to say all the kids who are doing the pronoun thing are that way, but a lot of kids don't really have that big of a reaction at home. But it's when they're in contact with their peers or anyone affiliated with their school, that's when they're like, no, I have to, demonstrate that I'm one of the cool kids. I'm one of the they thems, right? And so of course, it makes sense that a kid who's worried about this peer pressure is going to go to their teacher saying, I need to be called this at school, because the teacher is going to model this in front of the peers and they're going to get socially rewarded for it. Um, and then you have the dynamics. There's, I'm sure a lot of listeners are familiar with libs of TikTok, where
Mhm.
they expose some really disturbing videos of teachers with an obvious agenda. And these teachers who have their secret closets where the kids can change into a superhero by putting on clothes that are usually for the opposite sex. These teachers with the cool hair and the cool this and the cool that, like, of course you want to be cool with those teachers. You want to get their special favor. You want to emulate them and be like them. So there's just so many reasons that a kid might want to socially transition at school, and the adults are involved aren't examining any of that. They're just going with this narrative that it must be because the parents are so horrible. And so our job is to protect the kids from their parents, when really
Mm.
it's not too different from, well, this is the other thing, is kids naturally triangulate adults to see what they can get away with. Like if parents are divorced, and typically in almost any divorce, one parent is going to be more permissive than the other. It's, you rarely find parents who are equally permissive, right? And so, the kid might go ask the more permissive parent for something that they're going to say yes to and hide it from the less permissive parent. And you can't blame kids for that. It's just how they're figuring out how people work and how they can get what they want. And it's our responsibility as adults to be cohesive, for in cases of divorce, to try to get on the same page as much as possible about what the boundaries are for the kid's sake. And how is this really any different? A kid going to one adult saying, I know that you'll give me this thing I want, so let's hide it from the other adult who won't give me what I want.
I come back to that projection. You mentioned projection of abuse. I also think the power of suggestion is really powerful with
Yeah.
students. So whether they're seeing a written question, and it's not just in these surveys, what I'm noticing is even in the academic subjects, let's say they read a novel, the questions they're asked to talk about or write about with regard to the novels, most of which at this point is struggle literature too. They're doing a lot of dystopian
Mm.
stuff and a lot of struggle literature, meaning, written very, very recently about somebody's struggle against, oppression. And the questions are asked about their feelings, their feelings. So
Mhm.
they're not asking the student necessarily to look at the characters or to have that nice emotional distance. That when we were
Mhm.
students, we would read literature and we'd be able to talk about what is the character thinking or how do you know?
Mm.
They're putting themselves into every story, into every narrative. And I, again, I'm a layperson, but I feel like that encourages a kind of for lack of a better word, narcissism. And it's not, I don't mean NPD. I mean just
Mhm.
everything's about me.
Self-focus.
Right.
Yeah.
And not in a good way. And I was just
Yeah.
wondering what you think about that.
I agree, about the power of suggestion. Even adults in grad school, we talk about med student syndrome or grad student syndrome. I remember, as a full grown adult in graduate school, my training in psychopathology, where we actually go through the DSM, we were warned, hey, you're going to think you have every diagnosis. You're going to read these and be like, oh, is that me? And so if an adult can read about symptoms and be like, "Oh, I do kinda get that way sometimes. Maybe I have this disorder." I mean, if an adult can be that way, how much more can a kid be that way? Like, "Oh,
Right.
maybe I do think or feel that way."
Right.
I also hear that, it's sort of taking away from the development of a healthy theory of mind, right? I think right now there's a lot of emphasis on some kind of, um perversion of empathy and compassion. It's very feelings based, right? And it's like you're supposed to feel a certain way about
Mhm.
things. And the way you're supposed to feel also depends on, your demographics. Like, if you're a quote unquote privileged demographic, then you're
Right.
supposed to feel remorseful for something you didn't do. And if you're an oppressed demographic, then you're supposed to feel righteously angry and sullen. I mean, whereas, we know that reading literature, fiction, is actually good for helping us develop theory of mind. I think that there needs to be more of an emphasis on cognitive understanding of other people because for all of the emphasis on empathy and compassion, I think we have very little. I think that I don't see people who are focused on this really developing a strong sense of understanding of how people can think differently. Cultivating a good theory of mind can help you do that, right? Cultivating the ability to see things from different perspectives, including, yeah, analyzing a novel and, why did this character do that? That was a strange choice, but can I think about the world as she was experiencing it and how that made sense in that situation? And instead of that, there's this kind of emotional collusion of the overemphasis on empathy, but that doesn't actually lead to much cognitive development. And I do think that it's healthy for problem solving for us to not get caught up in feelings all the time. It doesn't mean that we're heartless, right? It's you have to have a degree of detachment, like you're saying, to really be able to stay grounded and offer support if someone's going through something.
Right.